Hello everyone, this is Darcinovia here. This is my review on Courtship of Princess Leia. This novel was published after the Thrawn trilogy, and since I'm reading and re-reviewing this stuff in chronological order, the best way I can, at least through the novels, I finally come across one of the few novels before the Thrawn trilogy, and this is The Courtship of Princess Leia. Now, this is one novel after finishing it today. I wish I would have read years ago, back in 2015. But back then, I was in a haste to collect every expanded universe novel because I was in a frenzy because I didn't know if Lucasfilm at some point wouldn't just cease publishing these things. So, Courtship of Princess Leia was not a high priority for me to read at the time. So, I'm going to discuss what I think of this story. Do I believe it's necessary for people to read this story? How does it contribute to the overall picture of the expanded universe? Now, this novel was published early in the expanded universe, so there are things that you may be familiar with if you've watched TCW, like the planet of Dathomir first was introduced here. That Dathomirian witches were first introduced in this novel. And this is a novel that introduces various characters that would be the parents of a character that would play a huge role in the Young Jedi Knight novels. So yeah, Courtship of Princess Leia. This is a novel that takes place after Solo Command, despite it being published before Solo Command. And Han Solo hasn't seen Leia in months, and Prince Isidore comes, and the Harps Cluster offers an alliance to help the New Republic in their war against the Empire. An alliance through marriage. Now, things aren't what they seem, which I'll talk about later in this review. Han, feeling like he's going to lose Leia and out of jealousy, goes out, wins a planet, and not knowing that it's actually in enemy territory, presents it as a gift to Leia, only for it to end miserably. Han, out of desperation, in order to not lose Leia, kidnaps her, goes to Dathomir, and offers her 7 days, and if she doesn't want to be with him, we all know how this story is going to end, considering they're married and have children in the Thrawn trilogy. But the premise is not necessarily the best thing in the world. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I held off reading it for so long, because the premise didn't sound that interesting. And not to mention, yeah. But when you get past some of the more problematic stuff about this book, I actually thought it was a pretty fun novel, and I had a really fun time with it. Yeah, there is some problematic things about it by today's standards, like some of the stuff you could argue can be kind of a little chauvinistic and possibly misogynistic. But I actually think I would look at this novel, if you read it, as a product of its time. I do think that it's a story that I do think it's a lot of fun. I actually like how it explored different aspects of the Force, because back in the early 1990s, there was not really that much material regarding Force orders other than the Jedi and the Sith. The expanded universe was still new, so any faction that existed that had nothing to do with the Jedi or the Sith I actually like enjoyed the origin of how Force users came into being on Datamir, and we got some glimpses of, even though it was brief, of what Yoda was doing during the final years of the Old Republic. Well, a few centuries before the prequels. And even though this is mostly a Han and Leia story, I actually thought this was pretty fun. It felt like something that you would see in the original trilogy if you were to read it. I felt the characters that were introduced, I think, worked. I think Prince Isidore, I thought, you know, I'm already familiar with this character because I've read everything that he was featured in before I read this. And since this is his first appearance, I think, they did he did a good job, the author, of making this character likable. And his wife, Tennille DeJoe, I think that's her name. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The mother of Tennille Ka. Since I never read this story before, it was interesting to read about their first meeting. Now, considering this is Star Wars, and one thing that, that I'm just not going to criticize this, because it's pretty much a Star Wars tradition of people falling in love under weird circumstances. I mean, Han and Leia fall in love for whatever reason. Anakin and Padme Anakin meet it better as a child, and then he meets her again as an adult. I mean, we kind of have to suspend our disbelief when it comes to Star Wars romances, because this is Star Wars here. This isn't like Romeo and Juliet, which, well, I'm not even getting to the problematic aspect of that story. This isn't some romance that is written by a romance author. This is Star Wars, and it's a Star Wars tradition. Now, Zinx, the character doesn't really play much of a role here. He is a minor character, and I could see why he isn't featured that much. I mean, if he doesn't seem to be that interesting, and he's kind of one-dimensional, so I can understand why he'd be difficult to write. And the X-Wing novels, because all they had was what is established here. And now, what do I like about this novel? Well, I like the fact that it introduced a different culture of Force users. And I like getting perspective on how other beings in the galaxy who touch the Force look at the Force. Because back when this novel was published, there weren't that many alternatives to the Jedi. And I'd argue one thing in Star Wars, and I can't believe I never talked about this up until this point. I wish we would actually get more perspectives on other Force users besides the Jedi. Because I think it's interesting, because with a galaxy full of billions of beings, there's no way there's like just one sect of Force users that follow the light side or the dark side. So I appreciate the author, despite the universe still being in its infancy back when this was published, giving the reader a different perspective of what the Jedi are, or what the light side or the dark side are. Because the witches on Datamir, they have a very different perspective when it comes to the Force. They consider it magic. Which, if you haven't left a planet and all you see people using weird powers, the Force is like magic. And if you really think about it, the Force is kind of the magic system of Star Wars. So it was interesting to actually get a different perspective on what the Force is from the perspective of people that don't understand what Jedi or Sith are. That's one thing I liked about this novel. I like the characters that are introduced here. I think Isidore and Tennille Dajo were good characters. I I think Isidore was a cool character. Tennille Dajo, there might have been a little problematic aspects considering her age, but this is Star Wars. I'm not. That's a poor defense. I mean, Han and Leia have a large age gap. It's like at least a decade at the very least, so that doesn't really bother me that much. And I think some of the treatment of some of the female characters is a little problematic, but other than that, I'll just get to the stuff I don't like in a bit. I actually like how this actually explains how Luke acquired knowledge, because this novel, along with others, were not published when the Thrawn trilogy was being published. It was published after, so we actually get glimpses of how Luke accumulated so much knowledge on the Force. Because if you were to read the Jedi Academy trilogy, which came out after the Thrawn trilogy, and I believe this came out during or before the Jedi Academy trilogy, you would figure, how did Luke manage to become a Jedi Master? How did he manage to actually become as powerful as he was? How did he manage to actually continue his training? Well, this novel, we learn that Luke acquired more knowledge because he meets a Jedi that is centuries old who was waiting for Luke to acquire that knowledge. So I do like that explanation, and I do like that the humor that this novel does feels Star Wars. It doesn't feel out of place. And as usual with these novels, I feel like this novel, the characters are all in character. It feels like a continuation of their stories, despite this being published after the Thrawn trilogy. This feels like a Star Wars novel through and through, and that's what I like about it. I think Courtship of Princess Leia, I had a fun time with it. It isn't the best Star Wars novel I've read, but I think it was entertaining throughout the entire novel, and I am looking forward to reading it again in the future. Now, what I don't like about Courtship of Princess Leia, at least to get what I dislike about it, I actually think some of the aspect of this novel haven't really aged well. Like, I think Han Solo kidnapping Leia is problematic within itself. Which is like, okay. I mean, the very concept of Han Solo kidnapping Leia was, and Han Solo, like, no consequences whatsoever. It's like, wait, yeah, I know he is a general, but he kind of kidnapped a high up in the command structure of the New Republic. The fact that he suffers no consequences for that is odd. And I kind of think that's a little strange how the New Republic wouldn't do anything to Han Solo. Doing that despite the fact that I'm surprised he wasn't thrown in prison. Now, this is a nitpick here, because this takes place before the Thrawn trilogy, and obviously none of the stuff I said happens, or would happen anyway, considering the Thrawn trilogy takes place like not too long after this. So this is a nitpick here. I also just think that some of the pasting could be a little weird at times. I think you have some parts of the novel where it goes really fast, and some of it's where it's really slow. I think when you're around the first quarter of the novel, it takes a little bit for it to get interesting. It isn't until it reaches Dathomir where things get really interesting. So I feel like for the first like quarter of the novel, I feel like it kind of drags on its feet, which is a reason why I would not rank this as one of the better Star Wars novels. But I still think it does its job of entertaining. I just find the part that where Han's and everything's introduced, the conflict, regarding Han and Leia, and Han kidnapping Leia is just not a thing I'm a fan of. I think the way the portrayal of the Datamanian witches and the cultures in general is a little is problematic. Despite my criticism towards this, I still enjoyed the novel, despite some of the issues I have with it. I think Courtship of Princess Leia does a fantastic job of telling the story of how Han and Leia end up getting married, but in my opinion, is this novel really essential for expanded universe enthusiasts who want to know everything there is to know about this massive, beautiful universe that is the Star Wars expanded universe? No, it's not essential. It really isn't. You could skip this one over if you're not interested in this kind of story. Though, I would still give it a shot regardless, but it's not essential. I don't think this is as good as Truce of Pakora, which I think is a fantastic book, which takes place right after Return of the Jedi. And it's, if anything, I regret not doing a deep dive on that novel like I am in this one. I would view this as the middle part of a trilogy of novels that focus on Leia. The first part of it has Leia being confronted with Anakin Skywalker. The second has her dealing with her relationship with Han. And the final part of the trilogy, which I'm going to talk about next time I talk about this trilogy, is Tatooine Ghost. Now, considering that I'm read this trilogy, all of it, but reading this particular novel for the first time, I do regret not touching this book when I could have. But, like I said earlier in this review, it's not essential. Now, my final thoughts on the Courtship of Princess Leia. Do I recommend this? I've already said earlier that it's not essential for this to be read. And I'm mostly speaking from people who are getting into the expanded universe, but are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material. And from this point onward, since I'm revisiting a majority of this era, I'm going to talk about which stories do I feel like are essential to the main storyline from here all the way to Crucible. Which ones do I think are essential? Because the New Republic era has a lot of novels. A lot. And not everyone's going to want to read all of those novels. So, I'm going to recommend them in categories such as how good the novel is, how essential it is to the overall storyline, and then give a final rating. Now, the thoughts about this novel, overall, I think it does a good job of entertaining the reader. If you enjoy these kind of stories, you do have to take it into consideration. This novel is a product of its time. I don't think it's aged as well as a lot of other novels that were published at the time. I think certain aspects could be looked at as misogynistic and borderline chauvinistic against third world cultures if you're that sensitive. I also think that some people may not find the idea of this kind of story to be entertaining. Some people may find this boring. And so this novel is not going to be for everyone. Because I've heard various opinions about this book. There's those who enjoy it, like me, and there's those who thought it was boring or it sucks. So, obviously, how am I going to recommend this? I'd only recommend this if you are a fan of Han Solo and Leia as characters. Because I feel like that is the kind of audience that will enjoy this novel. Now, you may not enjoy this novel even if you are a fan of the characters. So, I would recommend at least reading it once. If you don't like it, then you don't have to read it again. So, my final rating for The Courtship of Princess Leia is, I think it's a good book. Despite some of the issues I have with the novel, despite this novel not being for everyone, I actually think that it's one of those books that I recommend checking out for yourself. I recommend at least read it for yourself and tell me what you think if you've read this novel before. Do you agree with me or disagree with me? Now, The Courtship of Princess Leia is the second part of a trilogy. And the next time I review a novel, it's going to be Tatooine Ghost. Another novel that has a reputation that is mixed by the fans. Anyway, may the Force be with you, and as always, stay safe,